Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of speaker interviews. It's my pleasure to be interviewing Karen Silverman, who's the founder and CEO of the Cantellis Group and a member of the Global AI Council at the World Economic Forum. And Karen will be speaking at our AI in Financial Services Summit in London on the 21st of November. Karen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Indeed, indeed. Obviously, this interview is very timely because the UK government is hosting today its International AI Safety Summit. And my first question is really about how timely this is or not. I mean, do you think that there is sufficient understanding on the part of governments of what AI actually is and of its potential? And if they don't have such an understanding, is it possible to design appropriate and effective rules?
I mean, I think that's the big question, right? Is that regulation is either too late or too soon, right? And it's getting that timing right is pretty tough, and getting enough information and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, in terms of getting up to speed is rough. But I think what we're seeing is new forms and new experiments and innovation, frankly, with how to regulate to meet the moment. And that's why there's a lot of talk about agile governance. Bletchley Park announcement is sort of rolling out as we record this. I think it's both a very clear statement of the need and the demand for international cooperation and for some of the upskilling and education you're talking about. And it's also a clear kind of understatement of what needs to be done. And we need to sort of plod through all of that. So can they get up to speed? They're going to try to innovate ways to get up to speed. And I think the better of the governments and efforts, pan-regional government efforts are going to be innovating ways to continually update their understanding and their approach to these really complicated, multifactorial problems.
Yeah, as you say, a very, very complex problem. And of course, when you look at the attendance list at Bletchley Park for today, a number of the very large tech firms are there. And one has to wonder, to the extent that they dominate the AI industry and probably have most to gain, whether there's a danger that the largest AI companies help government shape regulations that effectively protect their own interests and in the process probably stifle competition. Do you think there's a danger of that?
I think there's absolutely a danger of it. I think what's different maybe a little bit this time is that everybody's aware of the danger. I think we faced that in some prior rounds than that went unobserved or lately observed. What we do about it is another really interesting question, and I think is a little bit to be determined. Interestingly, I think in order to accommodate that fact, as you've just set it out, the aspiration for Bletchley Park and the UK summit actually sort of morphed to align with the attendance as opposed to the other way around. I think what it misses, and this I'm not the first to observe it, is that the vast majority of activity around that, involving artificial intelligence doesn't involve these companies at all. It's what other people and entities and organizations do with these technologies. And that is really where a lot of the both opportunity and mischief sit. So we need to promptly get on to that phase of events. Well, but I think the risk remains that there are some, as I think one of them referred to them as moats, that these sorts of regulations and standards establish. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have regulations and standards. So we've got to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, turning to the UK government's own approach, the so-called pro-innovation approach to regulation, but what do you think the pros and cons of that are?
I think I really applaud it. I think there is an opportunity on the world stage to sort of chart a middle course that is pro innovation and still set some both baseline standards and some aspirational um, uh, sort of reach goals. And I think so. Whether this gets there or not, we'll find out. And by the time we meet, maybe we'll have more to say on that. But I do think there is the opportunity at this moment for someone to lead in that space. One of the things that also happened this week was that the White House issued its executive order on a
Yes.
lot of these same topics, and I think you're starting to see some convergence on a balance between innovation and governance, and sort of the efforts to integrate those two as concepts rather than always have them in opposition to one another. So I think, and I would credit the UK effort at inspiring and accelerating the timing of a lot of this stuff too. So,
And for our audience, Karen, can you explain the effect of an executive order from the president versus, I don't know, the SEC or the COTC or another regulator setting out a rule? How does that play out? How much more effective or less effective is it?
yeah, well, it's a first step. This is sort of a layered approach. I think it's really important to state and expand on what are now declared federal standards. They don't have the force of legislation, and so you'll see in the executive order at times it encourages and calls for more legislation. But it's an effective way for the government to establish its policy in sort of one fell swoop, and to instruct both the private sector in some respects and other federal agencies in other respects how to go about this business, and setting baseline concepts around this. So it's much more it has much more effect than just an ordinary policy statement. It has
Yeah.
much more effect than, for instance, the NIST risk management framework, except to the extent that framework is incorporated into the executive order. So it does have the force of of mandate behind it in some respects, but it does not have the force of law in the same way that a congressional piece of legislation would.
Okay, but it paves the way for further future regulatory developments.
In a much more muscular way than we've seen to this point.
Yeah,
So.
which I think is good news. But you applauded the UK government approach, but what's your view about the EU AI Act? I mean, other than China, the EU is probably the only region that's got an almost fully developed AI regulation. And do you think by virtue of it being a sort of like a first mover advantage, it's going to provide the model for other jurisdictions?
I think it might, and I think it has to some degree. So I would applaud that effort too. But as much for getting comprehensive thought around these issues out there, for they're really grappling with very hard issues. And I think some of the discussions and that are preceding the ability to get that enacted reflect the complexity, and they're surfacing a lot of these issues before anybody else has surfaced these issues, and so therefore giving, I think, the world a very strong signal about where the consensus will be and where the difficulties will be, and that in and of itself is a huge value.
Yeah.
The particulars of the act, first of all, we don't completely know them yet, and they're still in flight. But I think the prospect of an omnibus AI act is a much more difficult prospect to appreciate than sort of the approach that the UK and the US are taking at this point, which is more sectoral, more context driven. That said, I think they've done a great service in getting the suite of issues onto the table and into the discussion, and really set a baseline for how the conversation has gone.
Yeah, so at least it's highlighted the issues of But perhaps it could. The danger is it's a bit too rigid and prescriptive, and things move on, and it won't work quite so well.
Yeah,
But
the agility point is a really important one, and it's unclear how that. But first of all, when we say regulating AI, that doesn't mean anything in and of itself, right? And so any omnibus anything is going to suffer from both rigidity. It's going to be both over inclusive and under inclusive the minute it leaves the barn.
yeah, no, absolutely. And on a wider point, and we're up against our time limit, I'm afraid, but on a wider point, do you think that jurisdictions around the world will, at some stage, be able to agree a set of core principles, perhaps, that could help harmonize AI regulation globally? Or do you think that with politics, culture, et cetera, that's an impossibility?
I haven't given up on that. I think and I think you're starting to see some of, there's the G7 effort,
Yeah,
there's the OECD, which builds on the OECD principles, this latest statement out of Bletchley Park, even the, various bilateral efforts. And the issue with AI regulation also is that not only does it mean too much as a phrase, but it has to occur at theoretical aspirational levels and also at sort of tactical regulatory levels, and that's a very hard balance to strike. I think at the aspirational level, getting international principles should be achievable,
yeah.
and we're seeing progress toward that. I think when it gets down into the cultural and contextual specifics, I don't know that we'll ever see a fully harmonized or should ever see a fully harmonized regime, but somewhere between those two is where this will settle out. And it's interesting that that I think 2023, 2024 will look back on those years where some of that aspiration consensus, the consensus around the aspirational principles was fully articulated.
Mm. Well, that's a good positive note on which to leave this for now. For our viewers, we very much hope that you'll be able to join us in person at the AI and Financial Services Summit, which is being held in London on the 21st of November, where we'll be investigating and discussing these issues in even more depth. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for joining us today, Karen. I very much enjoyed speaking to you.
Thank you for having me.